Well, good morning. We're back to our study on the life of Joseph in the Old Testament. Um, Last week we left Joseph in Genesis chapter 41. Um, he had quite a day. He woke up in prison, and by that night he was in the palace with nice sheets. And so it was a great story. He'd been in prison another 2 years. Pharaoh, though, has some dreams, has two of them, and he's very troubled with what he dreamt, and his interpreters, his wise men, had no clue what it all meant. But lo and behold, the cupbearer, who had been helped by Joseph, heard this, and he suddenly remembered that Hebrew kid that he was with in jail, and how he had interpreted his dream. And so he gets up and gets enough guts, I guess, to tell Pharaoh about him, and lo and behold, not too long after that, Joseph is hauled up in front of probably what was then one of the most powerful men in the world. And Joseph interprets his dreams right there on the spot. Tells him some good times are coming, and then some really bad times are coming. And with that, he goes ahead and adds a plan that he says would work to help Pharaoh save his land. And I'm sure that with God's providence and opening up Pharaoh's mind, Pharaoh was totally sold on what Joseph had proposed. And in the end, Joseph was given the job of running the country and getting it ready for what Joseph said was coming. So in the course of about a 24-hour period, here he is now second in command in all of Egypt. So that's kind of where we are today. We're going to be moving in to see, really, it's almost like the day after. We're going to see how Joseph reaps really the rewards of righteousness, but it's the rewards of trusting God, keeping his trust there, and letting God work in his life, okay, and having the patience and staying in the race. And that's what we're going to look at today. But let's begin with a word of prayer. Father, I just thank you for this day, again, the opportunity to come, as always, to study your word. And Father, I just again lift up the issues of the day, that you will intervene, Father, to help us get back to normal in many, many ways. Just pray for that, and I also pray for, and I know that many people are out there hurting for various reasons. You know them all, and just pray that you would be with them, comfort them, guide them, give them healing if that's the case, if it's your will, but show them that you are close by. And I just pray you'll open our hearts to what this fine man, young man has to say that we can still use in our lives today. And this is in your son's name I pray. Most of us, I think, have come to the point in our lives, well, I know I have for sure, when we can look back on our life's journey and gradually, maybe, suddenly, see a very distinct pattern that's occurred in our lives. And all the way through that, we see God's fingerprints, if you will, handprints in everything in a lot of parts of our lives. He's been there, was there, and it all seems to come into place when we see that. Our entire past really becomes a beacon to the working of God's providence and wisdom, oftentimes despite ourselves. I know there's times when we're thankful for the faith that we had and the trust we had in him during a situation in our life, and we stayed with him, and we saw how God could work really phenomenal things. Many times, things work out that you think, man, this could never happen, but it was God who was doing that. And there's times when we are ashamed, quite frankly, that the fact that he acted on our behalf despite our faithlessness and our decision to go off and know we're going to do this ourselves, and usually with disastrous results. Well, Joseph now, as prime minister, if you will, must have really looked back, he had to have many times, in amazement at what happened in his life. To rise from being a slave and to boot a convicted slave in prison in a foreign country to become the most powerful of then the most powerful kingdom. Folks, it's a rarity in world history. I think in all of annals of human history, there's not a story like this one of what happened so quickly to Joseph. But the morning after, and now he's prime minister, if you will, and he had it all, okay? And that's kind of what we're going to look at this morning. 2 or 3 things that we put him into categories. The first one is that he had geographical control. He was responsible for the whole land of Egypt now. Its wealth at that time, folks, was immense. Let's go to verse 41 in chapter 41 of Genesis, and see what it says. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Now, most scholars for this era of time said that Egypt couldn't be compared to anywhere else, any other land in the ancient world, except maybe for Babylon later on. But it was a place of remarkable splendor. And, I would have loved to have gone back in this time frame to seen all the structures and the buildings and all colored in. And, they were all painted, I'm sure, and adorned. The ruins that we see today don't give it justice, quite frankly. But it was also a place of remarkable influence. These people had a lot of education. They had a lot of knowledge that they had acquired. They had military might, and they had limitless wealth. And that wealth fueled their military. And what did Pharaoh tell Joseph? He's told him, you are put in charge of the whole land. Great idea. He also had financial authority. Look at verse 42. Then Pharaoh took a signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. So, basically, Pharaoh is what meaning here is he just gave Joseph an open-ended budget. I don't know how many of you probably have ever heard of an American Express black card, okay? But I can guarantee you one thing, all of us or most of us will never have one, nor will be asked to have one. This card is given only really to the rich of the rich, all right, and it's by invitation only. And oh, by the way, if you accept the invitation, you can cough up $7,500, pay $2,500 a year. But here's the kicker. American Express has no limit on that card. They will follow through and pay up whatever comes through as a charge on that card, okay? I read somewhere where there was 2 instances where 2 black card owners or carriers, one fellow bought a painting at an auction that was $170 million, and he paid for it by an American Express black card. And another fellow from the Middle East someplace bought a 747. And it's just amazing that they would be willing to do something like that. But folks, I'm sure they have vetted these people and know that they have the assets. But that's kind of what happened with Joseph. The king was telling him, do whatever it takes. I trust you. So let's talk about the ring. The original Hebrew word was translated to signet ring. It really means to sync. And what this meant was the Pharaoh had a unique ring with an engraved image on it. And this was used to sink this emblem into a very little tiny bit of soft clay to put on tablets or parchment, and it was a sign of approval, okay? When invoices or purchase orders, so to speak, were placed in front of Joseph, he stamped the Pharaoh seal on them, and that mainly said, done deal, it's okay. Joseph had become the go-to man when things had to get done. He also had social prestige. Look at what else in verse 42. He got dressed in royal garments, given a gold chain. It's almost like Pharaoh sent him down to Hart Shafter and Marks and had him dressed in 8 or 10 new suits. Okay, the son of Jacob now had wealth, he had authority, and he had power, and he was going to look the part. I am sure that the Pharaoh gave Joseph a house, a nice one. And I bet he had servants, and he had a nice salary, and he had it all. Okay? He had royal privilege. Look at verse 43. Goes on. I like this. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and men shouted before him, "Make way!" Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Basically what happened here is that Pharaoh gave Joseph a private limo and a driver, okay? And his license plate read 2, right behind Pharaoh. He was always right behind the big man. People bowed in his presence. I cannot help but think about the time probably when it came that Potiphar and probably his wife bowed to Joseph. What in the world probably went through his head at that instance? But he had royal privilege. He had political power. Look at verse 44. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all of Egypt. In other words, Joseph, I'm not going to do anything until I check with you. That's the kind of authority he had. Ultimate political power, people bowing down. I wonder that for a while it really must have been uncomfortable for him to see all this pomp and all these people bowing down to him. He was only 30 years old, really just a young man. And he was still bearing the scars of slavery. And here he is now riding through the streets and all these people kneeling down before him. Folks, that type of situation could have gone to Joseph's head. But as we're going to see, it really did not. And I think that's the crux of this story today. And believe it or not, he also had religious position. Look at verse 45. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphenath Paneah, and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. So Pharaoh changes Joseph's name and gives him a wife. Okay? Both names meant, as far as Egyptian or the Pharaoh, that God speaks and lives. Don't get this wrong. Pharaoh hadn't converted over to the one true God. He was a deist. And to them, any time they thought a certain God was really treating them well, that was the God of the hour. All right? And now for Joseph coming through here, and this God, Pharaoh was giving him leverage and some latitude with his God and worshiping him. I'm sure he probably allowed him to speak about that, which I think probably was a good thing. But it was Pharaoh's best way to attempt at indicating that he believed and wanted others to believe that Joseph was no ordinary man. So how did things go with Joseph's plan? Well, let's look at 46 through 49. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. And during the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city he put the food grown into the field surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because he was beyond measure. That tells you how good the 7 years had been to Egypt, as far as their crops and I'm sure their livestock. And Joseph took advantage of it, just like he told the Pharaoh that he should be doing. And that's what he did, okay? So, with all that, he's married now, and he has 2 sons, and he has a clear conscience, all right? God guided Moses, who probably wrote Genesis, to reveal the truth about a lot of areas in Joseph's life. He allows us to see what the man was really like inside. And in some, if there's anything about him that I think is true, Joseph had a humble heart. And that's very important. Look at verses 50 through 52. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potipherah, priest of On. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God had made me fruitful in the land of suffering." So, why does the writer give us these details? First, it shows, number one, that Joseph was monogamous. He had not made the same mistakes some of the other folks in his family had done in the past. He had one wife, bore him 2 sons. And then the second thing is that the writer of Genesis gives us some important things about the names of these 2 sons. Manasseh, Joseph was saying, "God has made me forget." Well, Joseph hadn't forgotten his family, but God had allowed him to forget the bad things. They were behind him. They didn't matter anymore. He didn't fret over them. He didn't stew. That's where he was, and that was, folks, that is where everybody needs to be in situations that they come out like that. The second thing with Ephraim, he was saying that God had blessed me beyond measure in a place that once seemed to bring only suffering. He was showing how blessed God had made him. He was showing his humility toward his God, reminding him that God had made me forget and God has given me so much. And again, how old was Joseph? My gosh, he's 30 years old. And it's amazing to see this kind of thing coming out of this young of a man, but it does happen. I think the lesson there, folks, is that youth does not preclude usefulness with God. He can use anybody of any age to get his story out and get his will done. You know, the Bible's full of a number of young people that became very effective leaders or very effective witnesses. David was only 30 when he was anointed king. Daniel was a teenager when he went into Nebuchadnezzar's court. And look at Mary, my goodness. She was just probably a teenager when she had Christ. So, with that said, let's talk a little bit about pride and vanity and authority and position, the things that come on. Really, we all have opportunities like this, and they become temptations. Plutarch was a first-century scholar who saw much abuse of power by the Romans, which they obviously did. He said this, that authority and position demonstrate in the tri-tempers of men by moving every passion and discovering every frailty. No beast is more savage than man when possessed with power. And man, that is a true statement. We can look through world history, folks, and see some of the most nasty people who came to power, who had it, and what they did with it was awful. You know, he didn't say every man was a beast, but the power offered a great temptation to become one. And of course, we see that Plutarch was absolutely right. It almost becomes our second nature to suspect those with power. You know, but not all really deserve the suspicion. God's grace, He has still provided people throughout history, folks, who are very humble and who were in great positions of power and authority, and they didn't let it go to their heads and became very effective leaders. I can think even in our own history here in the United States, if there's 2 people that I can think of would fill that bill, would be George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. You look at that, the history of those 2 presidents and how they handled themselves, what they did, the power, the authority never went to their heads. I think, if anything, they considered it almost a scary responsibility. And I think that's very important because we do have people like that still. So, lessons learned. Well, God had taught Joseph what I think Charles Swindoll said in his book in 3 areas: pride, perseverance, and the importance of performance and doing a job and doing it well. Let's look at pride real quick. You know, God had prepared him to be on guard against prideful behavior. He took a lot of years in there, but he learned some lessons. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called Mere Christianity, and I would recommend anybody who's a believer If they haven't read that book, it almost needs to be a primer. But he says this in the book. According to Christian teachers, the essential vice, the utmost evil, is pride. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, and all that are mere flea bites in comparison. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. Let me read that again. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. And I think that is absolutely so true. Folks, when you let pride and vanity take over in your heart, God's walking out the back door. He can't exist with it. And it's a sad thing. Regrettably, we've probably all been there a little. For some people, it becomes where it just camps in their heart and makes for hard times. You know, it's been said that not all men can handle full cups. I can tell you, Joseph certainly had a full cup, and it was dripping into the saucer, as far as I could surmise. But he had not only survived this test of prosperity, but used it to honor and glory of God. He did that, and he went through this whole process, all these years. He never changed in his humility and his desire to do the right thing. Let's look at perseverance. God had caused him to persevere, and now I mean in some very difficult and demanding circumstances. You know, there's a high price for high levels of leadership if that's the case. My gosh, you get into jealousy and rumors, false accusations, misunderstandings, break down the communication, sleepless nights, problems that never completely get resolved. Kind of sounds familiar today, for sure. And I cannot imagine that Joseph did not come up with some of these issues during his time because he was dealing with his fellow man. And that's the way this stuff usually works. And Joseph would face all these problems in the days ahead, which I'm sure he did. But Joseph was under pressure not to fail his human and divine master. And here's the thing. He had trusted in God, and God had prepared him well. That's one of the true benefits of putting your total faith and trust in God and letting him work his plan in your life without your hindrance. And then thirdly is performance. God had taught him the need to perform well, and he would have had to. If he had not performed well in front of Pharaoh, he probably would have been fired, if not worse. But he did his job well. And sometimes that is using the talents and abilities that God's given you to their full extent, but always doing a good job no matter what the task is. And this he had done. Well, the rest of chapter 41 spells out the 7 years of plenty. Joseph's storage system became immense. And when the famine hit, he faced the job now of doing the second half, which was an equitable distribution of all this vast amount of grain that he had stored up. Now look at the king's response at verses 53 through 55. It says this: the 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began. And just as Joseph had said, there was famine in all other lands. But in the whole land of Egypt, what? There was food. This must have been a terrible time as far as this famine going on. But in the whole land of Egypt, there was food. Joseph had done the job, folks. And Pharaoh, for sure, I know, was seeing that, the results of this young man and this brilliant idea that he had. So, when all of Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. I'm sure they probably got really nervous when all this started happening. But what does Pharaoh do? Then Pharaoh told the Egyptians, you go to Joseph and you do what he tells you to do. Now, isn't that something? Now, that is trust. But Joseph had proven his ability, and the Pharaoh knew it. Well, the famine was worldwide. Like I said, it must have been an awful time. And people were coming from far away to buy grain. Verses 56 and 57. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians for their famine. was severe throughout Egypt, and all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe in all the world. Did he have control? Oh, that's for sure. Gene Getz, the late Gene Getz, was a great Christian writer, and he said this about Joseph in a book he wrote about him. He said God's plan for Joseph was on schedule. His preparation was tailor-made for the task God had for him. And because Joseph passed each test, learned from each experience, and here's the important part, learned to trust God more, he was ready when God opened the door of opportunity. I hope you get that. He trusted him more, he let him work, and he was ready when God opened the door. He handled prestige and power without succumbing to pride, which was very important. He persevered with patience. And again, that came because he had trusted God and performed his duties faithfully and successfully. He was well prepared because he let God get him prepared. I want to read just real quick out of Lucado this time. And he says this: in the chaos called Joseph's life, I count one broken promise, at least 2 betrayals, several bursts of hatred, 2 abductions, more than 1 attempt at seduction, 10 jealous brothers, and in one case, of poor parenting. There was abuse, unjust imprisonment, 24 months of prison food. Mix it all together and let it sit for 13 years, and what do you get? The greatest bounce back in the Bible. I think that's so good. Jacob's forgotten boy became the second most powerful man in the world's most powerful country. The path to the palace wasn't quick and it wasn't painless. But wouldn't you say that God took his mess and made it into something good? And wouldn't you think he can do the same with yours? Tally up the pain of your past. Betrayals plus anger plus tragedies. Poorly parented, wrongly accused, inappropriately touched. Oh, how onerous life can be. Yet consider this question: is the God of Joseph still in control? Yes. Can he do for you what he did for Joseph? Yes. Might the evil intended to harm you actually help you become the person God intends you to be? Yes. Now, I love this last line. Someday, perhaps in this life, but certainly in the next, you will tally up the crud of your life and write this sum: it was all good. I totally believe that, folks. I totally agree. Someday, we're going to look back on everything that happened in our lives and what God had done and got us through, and we're all finally going to say that it was all good. So let's have some final thoughts here. You know, if we let God let us, we let him, he's going to teach us lessons to help us to avoid the pitfalls of pride, which again is the number 1 vice. And we fail often. All of us do. We have moments of vanity and pride we go through. But God will not use a Christian to a full extent who's prideful. He just won't. And I think a Christian who becomes too prideful, God's going to deal with them pretty harshly. But I want to go into Proverbs real quick and look at some verses about pride. And boy, there's plenty of them in Proverbs. Look at Proverbs 6:16 through 19. There are 6 things the Lord hates. Hates. You know, you don't see that word too much when it comes to the Lord, but the Lord hates 6 things. And 7 are detestable to him. Haughty eyes, and folks, that's just another word out of the NIV. It's another word for pride, okay? A lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, a false witness who pours out lies. That's a gossiper. As far as I'm concerned, or a slanderer, and a man who stirs up dissension among brothers. And boy, I think that sometimes fits certain individuals in our own church bodies that cause up dissension among the brotherhood. It's never good, for sure. Go to Proverbs 8, verse 13. To fear the Lord is to hate evil. I hate pride and arrogance, evil behavior and perverse speech. First two things is I hate pride and arrogance, for sure. And go on over to chapter 11 of Proverbs, to verse 12. It says this: when pride comes, then comes disgrace. But with humility comes the most cherished thing, folks, we can get from God, and that's wisdom. Okay? With humility comes wisdom. I like that. This pride business with God's children is serious stuff to Him, and I just don't think that often God will allow that to continue on with His own children very long before He comes to maybe make some changes. I think it's very important that we remember that. If we let God prepare us spiritually and emotionally to persevere in difficult times, He will do that, but He gives us choices. We can do it the hard way, or we can in our way, and we can get beat up along the way, but we'll probably still learn the lesson, but with many spiritual and maybe physical bruises. All of us have been there. And we look back and we wish, man, I wish we hadn't done that, hadn't made that decision, and let God just kind of work this thing out. God knows what the particular curriculum of instruction for each one of us should be to prepare us. He does, folks. He does. But if we want to settle for less and get in His way and tell Him I can handle this today, He usually will not violate our choice. That's what free will is all about. We often ask why we have to go through such trials and sufferings, and Paul gives us the answer in Romans 5:3, and I'm going to go over there real quick. He says this: not only so, but we also rejoice in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces what? Perseverance. And with that perseverance, what is it? Character. And when you have great character, you've got great hope. But what is the product of perseverance? In verse 4, he says it again. In verse 4, he says this: perseverance, character, and that's what it is. Joseph certainly had character because of all he had been through, and yet he stayed true to his God. You know, if we let Him, God will teach us to perform well, okay? No matter what the task is. I think good performance in our tasks in our daily lives, folks, is a great witness. We may not like our job, we may not like our boss, but if we go into that task and try to do the best we can, that's a great witness, and I think God expects that of all believers. And I think it's even more true with regards to responsibilities that God tries to lead us into as far as advancement of His own kingdom, working in support of the church. So with that said, Paul in 2 Timothy in chapter 4 tells us about life, this Christian life. We're running a race. And I tell you what, I've always liked that analogy. Christ expects all believers in our lives to get on the track and run the race, okay, as best we can. There's a funny thing, folks. There's no bleachers. There's no bleachers. Nobody can sit there and bench warm. You're either in it or you're in the ditch, okay? And Christ expects us to stay out of the ditch and stay in the race and stay focused on the goal, which is Him at the end of the race. Paul knew this, that we had to run this race, but he also knew that we had to finish it well. And he wanted his performance to always be of a good report. God wants no different of us. All right? And I think that's what we see in Joseph. Entire life that we're going to look at, he finished this race really well. You know, we are here to, number one, glorify God with our lives, but secondly, we are here to proclaim the good news. We're messengers. We're delivering the message, the good news of the gospel. And part of that way is the lives that people see that we lead. That's that race. They see us running it in our lives in a way that proclaims our faith. And folks, we need to try to finish well so that is how we were remembered. Joseph did it, and we can too. Swindoll says that with authority comes a need for accountability. With popularity comes a need for humility. With prosperity comes a need for integrity. If we are ever in those situations, and most of us are to some degree, we have to be very careful about the temptations that come along with what happens. But always, always, we need to keep our pride and our vanity in control. And Joseph, as we're going to see, absolutely did that. Not only in his affairs with Pharaoh, but as we're going to see later on in his affairs with his brothers, he was an absolute great witness. And for sure, as far as authority and prosperity and power, Joseph passed all three of the tests with flying colors. I guess I wanted to end this by saying this. My wife, many years ago, framed a picture of these guys running over a hill in a big race. And at the bottom of this thing was this phrase, that God helps best those who trust in Him, yet work hard to meet life's tests. And folks, that's what He expects of us. To trust Him totally, to wait on Him, to let Him work in our lives and bring the good results that we all want. But at the same time, He expects us to work hard to meet all the tests that life brings. Hopefully God will be able to say to each one of us, boy, at the end of that race, when we see the goal, and it's Christ Himself, that we totally did trust Him, did our best to meet the tests of life, and we did it with humility and worship to Him, and that we finished our life's race well. Joseph did, and I think we can too, for sure. Let's pray. Father, I just thank You again for this wonderful young man's story. Father, help us to control our pride, our vanity. Help us to realize that we need to stay humble before You, Father, and that we need to allow You to work in our lives unrestricted, and that if we trust in You and keep our faith in You, You will work great things in our lives that we should have. Just pray that You'll be with us this week, guide and direct us in all that we do, that what we do, Father, You'll be truly proud of each one of us. It's in Your Son's name I pray. Amen. Thank you. We'll see you soon.